Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game SO Tekken, part 4 of a continuing series called Coaxing the Cobra, where I try to get this Konami Cobra arcade PCB to show any signs of life. And this is definitely part 4. I've spent over 40 hours trying to diagnose and get this board booting. I basically put a full week in a full-time job into this board to try to get it to do something. And it's all for one single game, Fighting Bujutsu here. Not even one of the best games of all time, just a rare one that I wanted to get the hardware working for. And I've taken you along an entire journey of trying to get this thing built up, wired up, and diagnosed, and last I could tell that the hard drive that came with the game had the click of death, so I had to deal with that. But we've gone through the entire teardown process. I've shown you all the hardware on the board. We have built it up from scratch and wired this whole thing up for its first power on state, and every step of the way I was getting closer to trying to figure out what was going on with this board. I was concerned there was some sort of power issue. We were able to get the board booted up as far as the power rails are concerned, and I confirmed that every single rail, 12 volt, 5 volt, and 3.3 volt, were good to go from the power supply. But unfortunately, the first time I booted it up and every subsequent time, I would get error E1 on the top CPU board, and it would never actually try to read the hard drive, and I did have a click on that spinning platter drive, so I figured to myself it was probably time to change over to something a little bit different, because every single time I would boot this board, I would have the 3 LEDs for the power rails, but the 4th one would never light up for the hard drive activity, and the top board would error out on E1 almost immediately. The error is so early in the boot or post sequence that I don't even really feel like the board is trying to boot itself up. I tried different IDE cables, I tried everything I could think of to get a little bit more activity on this board and try to get something on the screen, at least something that I would be able to try and diagnose, but again I had no activity on the hard drive light, and I had that solid E1 error on the top CPU board, and there was nothing on screen except some black bars, so I knew I was getting some sort of output. And like I said, I listened to the hard drive and it was definitely clicking, so I figured it was time to switch this out for something different. This hard drive would have been done in 1997. They definitely fail over time, especially arcade hard drives would take some abuse, and for shipping, this thing has probably taken more than its fair share of knocks. So I figured let's go to solid state, let's do IDE to an SD card, try to get the hard drive image rebuilt and see if we can do anything from there. The nice thing is IDE to solid state is a very cheap adapter, $12 later, and everything was good to go. Same pinout, same Molex power connectors, just a different system as far as the storage is concerned. And while this top CPU board does have a ROM on it, and I did pull the ROM and it's fine for the ROM set in MAME, the game is stored on that hard drive. All of the content, all of the graphics, all of the music are going to be spooling off the hard drive. Those ROMs basically just get the game running on the actual PCB, and then from there it hands it off to the hard drive to basically put all of the data needed to execute the game and for you to play it into the board so that it can just basically be executed and drawn by the GPU. But if we can't even get the hard drive to boot, we really don't have much luck here whatsoever. So I grabbed the CHD file from archive.org, and I showed you how to do this some years ago on a Crypt Killer board, and all I'm going to do is download the CHD, which is the hard drive that's broken on this board set, and I'm going to go over to CHD Man, and I'm going to flash an SD card with that image, so the SD card now becomes the same exact image as the hard drive for Fighting Bujutsu. The code on the hard drive on the sticker matches the MAME CHD dump, so I know we're good to go. It completed perfectly fine, and I did check and I had a 1-to-1 copy. So now I've done this twice, one on a micro SD card with an adapter and one on a 4GB SD card. Not easy things to find anymore of that size. So this is now the installation of Fighting Bujutsu. It's basically emulating an IDE hard drive, and it's going to send data over to the arcade board if the arcade board will actually ingest any data. And trust me, this is the last part of the video series. Survive or fail, we're going to answer what's going on with this board today. So I'll go ahead and just wire this in like I would the actual IDE hard drive, and we're going to give it a power on to see what, if anything, changes. Because I need to get a different error other than E1 up on that counter, because it means absolutely nothing to me. It just means that the board is failing to boot or post whatsoever. That could be anything on this entire board set. There are 4 different PCBs, there's a massive power supply, there's so many different ways that this board can have an issue that would prevent it from actually booting, and that is the biggest issue when you have a general fault with no data behind it. You are kind of hunting in the dark, you have no idea what's going on. So now that we have the IDE drive in, let's flip the switch and power it on, and of course this time the board wouldn't even actually power on. I have absolutely no idea what was going on here. I was so confused. I traced the plugs all the way back to the wall. I made sure the circuit was fine. I unplugged the solid state IDE adapter to see if maybe that was preventing it from receiving power, but every single thing I did would not get this board to actually even take a power on state. Apparently this fuse must have been ever so slightly sitting in the wrong position, because I pushed it out just to make sure it was not broken in the trace there, and everything booted up perfectly fine after I actually plugged that back in. Why did this happen? I have absolutely no idea. It makes no sense whatsoever. It's basically because this board is haunted. And with that IDE drive installed, the solid state emulator, you're going to see we ended up at E1 almost immediately. The exact same behavior that the hard drive had presented, the spinning platter drive, is happening here on the solid state drive. I have no activity whatsoever. And I'm starting to think that it's not even attempting to actually read the disk. Yes, we have the power going to it, but that would be a separate section, bypassing the motherboard and going directly to the actual power supply in this instance. But again, we have absolutely no activity on the LEDs. We have card detect, we have power, but the activity light never flashes. It never even tries to read the contents of this. And we have the exact same problem on the counter there. I plugged the original board back in just for fun. We have an E1, and we also have no LED on the hard drive activity indicator. So let's just try that last card just to be 100% certain to see if maybe it's something about the card format. This is absolutely not going to change anything, but once you get to this point in time, you start grasping at straws and trying to figure out what else could I possibly do that's a variable to see if it changes any behavior. And you'll see here I have absolutely no LED on that indicator light for activity, and the hard drive does the exact same thing. Granted, it was clicking, but I don't even think it has a chance to attempt to read before the board halts its post and doesn't try to boot any further than that. That E1 indicator is just preventing the board from trying anything else whatsoever. So as a last ditch attempt, because I can't go over every single component on this board with a microscope, it would literally take me years, I'm just going to reseat the board, make sure the connection is good so that it's not a situation where there's a fitment issue preventing that board from getting a signal or a power line in some way, shape, or form. I know power is going to it fine. I checked off screen with my multimeter. All of the voltages are dialed in. But in those connectors, they are very high density. If one pin isn't sitting perfectly within its socket, you can end up in a situation where you end up with an error. I've seen it on my Konami NWK-TR board. My thrill drive board likes to sometimes do this as well, and it is a fitment issue. But I cleaned this connector, I reseated it, I used some deoxit, everything is clear, and I checked a couple pins for continuity. It is so high density I couldn't check every single one of them, but I took a cross section and everything passed good, so I feel like we have a good connection between the two boards. I'll go ahead and power it on, just the original hard drive again this time for no good reason other than why not, and you will see here as soon as that counter lights up, it's going to go to E0, bypass it, and hang right on E1. Again, it's not even trying to actually boot up. So unfortunately, this is the situation with this Konami Cobra board. It is 100% beaten me, and it seems to be that that top CPU board is where the issue lies, because I'm not getting any error codes on the main motherboard or the sub PCB with more Konami Power PC processors on them. There's just nothing I can see that make me figure out what's going on here. But it seems like the problem is isolated to this board. I tried all sorts of different dip switches. I tried desocketing and resocketing the ROM with some deoxit to make sure it was reading fine. Everything seemed to be good to go. Maybe one of these FPGA chips is not getting the code from this to do something. I do not know. This is such a high density board with so many traces. Trying to actually reverse engineer the entire pinout to make sure every single trace had continuity would probably take a solid week of actually looking. Or maybe it's something on this high density connector going into the GPU board. Maybe one of these pins is ever so slightly misaligned or not making great connection, or maybe one of those CPUs underneath the heatsink has a cracked ball grid array ball due to heat dissipation or lack thereof on the board. The reality is it could be any of these components here. Any single tiny little 80-bit of this board could be bad, and it would cause the entire thing to just cascade into failure. So as far as the Konami Cobra board is concerned, I am done with this thing. I have spent dozens upon dozens of hours trying to make this thing work. I have torn it down, I have cleaned it, I've reverse engineered as much as I can, and I've switched out the hard drive for a solid state adapter, and this board shows no signs of life. It it errors out within a second, and from there I get absolutely no information on the screen, which means if I was even trying to troubleshoot this thing, I have no idea where to start looking. My guess would be the CPU board with the E1 error on top, but that could be an error that is trying to ping another piece of hardware in the chain and it's not hearing back from it. So it's not even a guarantee that the error is isolated to the board that shows the error code. It could just be where it presents, and these codes are 100% lost to time, so I have no idea what E1 means. If you have any thoughts, leave them down below, but I did my damnedest to make this Konami Cobra work. We're powering off, and I will see you guys next time. Bye bye.